Today we are going to talk the 8 most influential horror writers of all time. These masters of terrors have been scaring us for over 200 years. Please join the conversation. Horror books are weird, aren't they? We purposefully pick them up and invite them into our heads, where they scare us not only while we're reading them, but we know full well that they're going to haunt us long after we finish them. Now, there are a lot of great horror writers out there. Today, we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at those writers that not only have scared us over the years, but have influenced all the generations of terror that have followed them since. So we're going back to the 19th century for our first couple of authors. So in 1818, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, a modern Prometheus. Now, I think a lot of folks have heard the story about how she and some friends were on vacation and they were doing this little storytelling competition amongst each other. Mary couldn't think of her story at first, but then one night, bam, it hit her. And she created one of the most enduring stories of horror and science fiction that's ever been written. I did include Mary Shelley's work in my top 6 list of the most influential science fiction authors because it belongs there. But if I had to choose, and I can only include Shelley's work on either a science fiction or a horror list, I would put it on the top horror list because it is scary. I bet a lot of folks are like me. See, I put off reading Frankenstein for the longest time because I assumed that with all the translations of this book into movies that I had a good gist, that I knew the gist of the story, right? When I finally started reading it, I was shocked at how different it was. Most of the interpretations there, I don't think are even close. A lot of them try to capture the essence, I guess, of the story, but I don't think they do a particularly good job. Frankenstein's monster is not a grunting kind of ogre running around. He's complicated. I think it's kind of cliche for folks to say, well, you know, Frankenstein, the doctor, he was the monster. There's no good guys in this story, at least not between Frankenstein and his monster. They're both quite hideous. And you do feel sorry for the creature, but you also quickly learn that there is no nice guy here between the two of them. Pick this up. If you haven't read this one, or if you think you know the story, think again. It is well worth your time, and it's clear why Mary Shelley has influenced writers all the way up to Stephen King beyond, because her work endures. Frankenstein's monster, he's creepy. We're going to go forward a couple of decades from Mary Shelley's work to the 1830s when we start seeing Edgar Allen Poe publish his poems. Now, Edgar Allen Poe is a master of terror. The thing that strikes me about him, the stories that he writes kind of lurk in the human imagination just as much as they may in the supernatural. His stories do seem to kind of bleed over into the ghost story, but not really. Some of the stories, like the ending of The Fall of the House of Usher, do seem to definitely kind of stumble over into the supernatural and ghostly and that kind of thing. But a lot of his stories are more in the terror that comes from within our own minds, or from the depravity of other humans. Take The Raven, The Telltale Heart, The Pit and the Pendulum. Those aren't ghost stories in and of themselves. They kind of summon that kind of imagery, but really the terror is either generated by the storyteller themselves, as in the case of The Raven or The Telltale Heart, or it's inflicted from an external source that are also humans, like Pit and the Pendulum. He does this in such a masterful way that if you go to Google, like I did, and you search Edgar Allan Poe ghost stories, all these stories that I just mentioned will show up in the top of the list because they just come across as so surreal and so horrifying that they stick with you just as good as any ghost story. So Edgar Allan Poe definitely deserves to be on the list of all-time horror writing greats. Now we're going to move up to the end of the 19th century. In 1897, Bram Stoker unleashed Dracula on us, and the world of horror has not been the same since. Now, the story of Dracula has been told so many times, I find it hard to believe that there's very many people that aren't familiar with Jonathan Harker's journey to Transylvania, where he meets Dracula, and how Dracula makes his way to England and torments Mina, and they run into Van Helsing and chase the vampire back down. The story has been told so many times that you may be tempted to not read the book. There is a key difference between the book Dracula and almost every single telling of the story, no matter how good or how bad, and it is this: Dracula is not a love story. Dracula is not some sympathetic character who just wants to be loved. He's a monster. The character you're supposed to be sympathizing with is not Dracula. It is the heroes or the characters whose humanity he is trying to steal. When I read this, I read it over the course of a couple of days many years ago, and I was absolutely just drawn into this, and I could not put it down. It's well worth your time. If you like horror, you need to check this out, if only because it really is what popularized vampires for over a century and still going strong today. So definitely one of the top, most influential horror books that you're ever going to read. Now we're going to start off the 20th century with H.P. Lovecraft and almost everything he has ever written. In the works of Lovecraft, you have this horrifying mythology that he's created. Even if you've never actually read his stuff, you may very well be quoting him or have heard him quoted and not even realizing. The elder god Cthulhu, the Necronomicon, those are his creations. There are these elder gods, these forces from beyond time that predate humanity and Earth for aeons, who are somehow bleeding over into the earthly realm. And what we have to deal with the protagonists of the story have to deal with, is where these massively powerful evil creatures are bleeding over into our reality. So for the most part, when you're reading these stories, you're in the position of the main character as they're trying to understand, what is happening. H.P. Lovecraft is a master, I think, of what they call cosmic horror. I actually read a full collection of his years ago in an ebook, and let me give you a couple words of warning. Number one is, I don't recommend you read these books end to end, all his works from cover to cover like I did. It gets a little tedious. He has a very distinct style of describing things, gabled roofs and cosmic gulfs and things like that after you read it a couple of times in a row, you're kind of like, okay, you said this already. Now, I'm not denigrating it. It works if you read the story, go on to something else, and then read the story again another story a little bit later. Don't read them end to end. I don't think he meant for that to be how folks read his work. Some of it gets a little bit wordy. I actually did not enjoy the Call of Cthulhu as much as I thought I would, or even in the Mountains of Madness. That one, even though I liked the story, it wasn't one of my favorites. But he has plenty of other stuff in his collections that are absolutely terrifying. And I hope this doesn't upset anyone, but I want to say it anyway. See, as I read his works, I became aware of some, what I thought at first may have been unfortunate words being used. I did a little bit of digging to see if I can confirm or refute my suspicions, but it turns out that during his life, H.P. Lovecraft was a pretty well-known racist. Some pretty nasty words kind of bubble up into a couple of his stories. Now, I am of the belief that you're a product of your culture. I can see, and normally, if I would be willing to say, okay, that was another time, another place. And some people have even said that H.P. Lovecraft kind of recanted of his ways, so that's kind of a sketchy or stretch of some of the evidence. But I say this because there are some negative words and some nasty kind of, I think, descriptions of other races that pop up in here. And I want you to be ready for it, because I don't think it's fair to just kind of say, hey, this is a great book, and then you're reading this, and then to suddenly see that kind of so casually thrown in there. I think the offensive part is he doesn't use these words to shock or to paint a picture. He just kind of has them casually in there, like that's just how he talks. And so I just want to throw that out there so you know what you're getting into. The stories are scary. He has obviously influenced generations of writers, but be aware of what you're getting. Okay, moving up into the 1950s, Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. Now, you may or may not know, I'm sure a lot of you have, a lot of folks are familiar with the Will Smith version of the story that he made a number of years ago now. But a couple other movies, one starring Vincent Price as The Last Man on Earth, The Omega Man with Charlton Heston, are all based off Richard Matheson's book. Now, of all these, Richard Matheson's book is better. And now I haven't seen all the Vincent Price movie, which I actually enjoyed what I saw of it. But Richard Matheson's I Am Legend is a fascinating book. It is creepy, and it's clearly inspired some later works that we're going to talk about here. It's a vampire story. The protagonist of the story finds himself alone, as far as he can tell, on the planet, and being hunted basically by vampires that have swept across the land. It's an amazing story. It's a really just, kind of a depressing setup. You just sympathize with him right away. It is a really good story. This idea, the loneliness that he has to deal with, and his evolving kind of attitude towards it, and the mania it drives, you can't help but feel for him. So it's got plenty of action in it and plenty of suspense. And it's got its sort of twist ending. So, Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, I think it deserves its place as one of the most influential works, because it kind of helped keep vampire stories kind of at the forefront of the genre. Shirley Jackson published The Haunting of Hill House. And The Haunting of Hill House is considered by many to be like one of the perfect examples of a haunted house story. And it is creepy. Now, some of you may be familiar with some of the movie versions of it. Netflix has a series that they came out with a couple years ago that I'm just now discovering and watching and enjoying very much. But The Haunting of Hill House it's sublime, just creepy as all get out. She is known for her gift with just surprise. I don't know how many folks have read, there's a short story that she published in 1948 called The Lottery. And if you haven't read it, I recommend you do. I had to read it in middle school, I think it was, as an example of writing the unexpected. And it was shocking. But she kind of made her name known with The Lottery when it was published in, I think, The Atlantic in 1948. But The Haunting of Hill House came out about a decade later, 1959. And again, it is very scary. If you've seen the Netflix adaptation, they borrow from it, but it is very different than what you saw there. Her work helped inspire Stephen King and other horror writers too, because again, she kind of defined the ghost story and the haunted house story. There is absolutely no way you could make a most influential horror writer list and not include Stephen King. Stephen King has been the king of horror for decades now, and his name is synonymous with terror. It's amazing how the humble beginnings. His first book was Carrie. It was published in 1974, I believe. It was a good book. Of course, it was optioned and made into several movies, actually. It's been remade a couple of times. But Stephen King's, I thought, the thing that's kind of cemented him into popular culture was his following book, his second published book, which is Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot, another vampire story, and that was absolutely nightmare-inducing. A lot of us grew up with the made-for-TV Salem's Lot movie, which, believe me, it has some horrifying scenes. I mean, it has some creepy stuff. Because some of it's kind of campy now, but it's definitely a good horror show. But if your only exposure to Salem's Lot is the movie, then you don't know the whole story. Count Barlow is not the Nosferatu-style Dracula. He's more of the debonair kind of vampire. But just like with Bram Stoker's Dracula, these monsters are not sympathetic characters. These monsters are evil. The vampire, it makes, I think, them far more terrifying because, again, as a human being confronted with something that can take away your humanity, that's one of the sources of a good horror story. So Stephen King, I mean, obviously he's written volume after volume of books beyond Salem's Lot. I've read probably about half of them. He's definitely, he's one of the masters, and certainly has put his stamp on modern horror today. And finally, we're going to wrap up with Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, or her vampire series. There's a lot of vampires in this list, aren't there? Anne Rice published Interview with a Vampire in 1976. I kind of think of myself as a purist when it comes to vampires, and meaning that I don't like my vampires to be sympathetic at all. But when I read Interview with a Vampire, I was absolutely stunned. It was so involving and so well written. It keeps the mysticism of vampirism. Even though the main character is a vampire, it keeps the mystery. They don't know what's going on either. And so they have to deal with this. The main character, Louis, he's telling his story to the boy, who is the journalist that he's trying to get to record his story of his 200 years of life. He tells the story of what happened to him, how the vampire Lestat turned him into a vampire, and then his struggles with his identity, who he is and what he is. Claudia is absolutely terrifying. But I thought of all her vampire books, that Interview with a Vampire was I think, the most standalone, sincere book. Now, Vampire Lestat, completely different as far as tone, but equally as enjoyable, powerful. Going from there, she kind of loses me a little bit once she gets to Queen of the Damned and beyond, but still, I would recommend them over a lot of other books out there. But Anne Rice, she kind of redefined and reintroduced us to what vampires, what's scary with vampires. They're still mysterious. They can be somewhat sympathetic in her universe. She just does an amazing job with it. So Anne Rice, definitely one of the queens of horror writing, and certainly has put her stamp on horror writing today. So guys, that's it. That's my top 8 most influential horror writers out there. I know that it was hard to whittle this down. Who got left off here that you would add? I need to know. I mean, every time we do one of these lists, I learn about a lot of other writers that some of them I hadn't even heard of. So let me know, who are the writers that we left off? Who would you recommend to be absolutely essential reading for the fan of horror writing? Please like and subscribe, and thank you so much for your time, and have a great day.